Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. Let's just wait a bit until people come in because we have a lot of people signing up. So I want to give everyone the opportunity to actually come in, and I see the numbers are rising rapidly. Just a little bit of patience until everyone is coming in. We don't want to have too much rush. Hello, everyone around the world. I'm really happy to welcome you to my traditional post-COP webinar. And I was thrilled to see the interest that we have had, exceeding all previous signed-ins. So I will talk about COP28. I've been there from 29th of November until the very end. So I will first look into the context. Where does this COP28 situate itself? What were its tasks? What were the aims of the presidency? Classically, of course, COPs have side deals. What side deals have been brought in? Who participated? And what was the spirit of the negotiations? Then I'll get into the key topics of the COP. Of course, the global stocktake being the number one topic, then loss and damage fund, then of course the climate finance negotiations, global goal on adaptation, just transition, mitigation work program, and Article 6. And then I will try to make an overall conclusion, and I will do an update on the topics and the hosts of upcoming COPs, because we have a unusually forward-looking view on who will host COPs and what are the topics that will be coming in the next years. So just for those who have not followed the regime from the outset, we have now over 30 years of history of the regime, which started with the Framework Convention 92, followed by the Kyoto Protocol to the Convention 97. Then 4 years later, the implementation agreement for the Kyoto Protocol, the Marrakesh Accords. Then, of course, it took a long time to actually fully operationalize the Kyoto Protocol and get it into force. And in 2009, we had the low point of the climate regime so far, the failure of the Copenhagen Conference. And then it took a number of years to remedy this failure and get the Paris Agreement. And of course, the Paris Agreement operationalization was done through the Katowice decisions, but a few items could not be completed in Katowice. And therefore, the Glasgow conference in 2021 was crucial in operationalizing the Paris Agreement. So these are the large milestones. And now, of course, I will situate the COP28. And of course, it had a predecessor, COP27 in Egypt and Sharm el-Sheikh. So that took the decision to operationalize funding for loss and damage and to set up a fund, latest at COP28. Then it had a work program on just transition. The mitigation work program was set up. And we had some cover decision regarding the phase down of unabated coal power and phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Otherwise, the COP27 was relatively successful, and COP28 got a lot of items on its table that actually originally had been scheduled for COP27. Now, of course, COP28 is not done in a vacuum. We had multiple crises, and we still have those. We have the geopolitical crisis. I don't need to number the wars that are currently raging around the world. We've had the energy crisis, which was triggered partially by these wars, and strong increases in energy prices, strong increases in revenues of fossil fuel companies, maybe some increase of renewables in the long term for energy security. We've seen massive increases in interest rates after a decade of very low interest rates, and we've seen the return of inflation. Of course, this is normally not conducive to good climate policies. And we see the climate crisis accelerating. The numbers for this year are mind-boggling. We seem to be very close to 1.5 degrees increase compared to a pre-industrial level. And we've seen a fair amount of really strong negative impacts, the record wildfires in Canada, the floods in Libya killing almost 10,000 people, and so on. So multi-crisis situation that, of course, is problematic for a good long-term policy. We had various relevant events in the run-up to COP28. We've seen the BRICS summit, which is interesting in as much as it has led to expansion of the membership of that country group. And the group, which has traditionally not been so much interested in climate policy, has made some statements that could be seen as promoting mitigation. We had the African Climate Summit in Nairobi in September, which brought together more than 10,000 delegates. It was almost like a COP. And the summit really brought Africa on the climate policy landscape. And there was the Nairobi Declaration pushing for a global carbon tax on fossil fuels, and also a lot of discussions on carbon markets and the role of Africa in those markets. We had the G20 summit. The G20 declaration didn't really push climate policy that much. And of course, there was a hot debate about phase out of fossil fuels. And therefore, of course, the conflict within the G20 could not be resolved. And therefore, the final declaration didn't address this topic. We had the pre-COP in October, organized by the host, and this time in the host country, not as in previous years outside of the host country. And at the very last moment, we got an US-China declaration on climate cooperation. Those of you who have been in this process for many years know that such US-China declarations always play a crucial role. For example, in the context of Paris and Glasgow, they were crucial in leading to a successful outcome of those important COPs. And therefore, of course, I was thrilled to see that John Kerry and his Chinese counterpart were able to overcome the mistrust in US-Chinese relations and push the target to triple global renewable energy capacity by 2030, which was, of course, a target that has previously also been raised by the COP presidency, also addressing methane and important aspects of emission reductions in the power sector. So what were the key tasks of COP28? So as said earlier, the global stocktake, which is a key aspect of the ratcheting up system of the Paris Agreement. You know that the Paris Agreement is a bottom-up system in comparison to the Kyoto Protocol, which was a top-down system. And of course, in a bottom-up system, you need some approaches that actually push countries to become more ambitious over time. And the global stocktake, which is now set every 5 years from 2023 onwards, is the attempt of the new regime to actually put some pressure on countries to actually do something. And the global stocktake has always been set 2 years prior to the next round of NDC updates. NDC updates are due in 2025. So the global stocktake in itself, of course, doesn't mean that the NDCs are immediately updated, but it shall inform those updates. Then the Sharm el-Sheikh decision clearly stated that the COP28 should set up the loss and damage fund, and ideally with funding already coming in. Then a critical topic was the global goal on adaptation. So That has always been the orphan sister of the mitigation, because adaptation can't be measured as easily as mitigation, and therefore it has been challenging in the past to agree on a framework that actually operationalizes this global goal. Then we have the mitigation work program that should help also to increase ambition in line with the 1.5-degree target. We have the increased attention towards just transition. We've seen in the past couple of years the emergence of just energy transition partnerships, and therefore a work program now was scheduled to be set up. We have the perennial negotiations about implementation of international cooperation under Article 6. So the two market approaches, the bilateral ones under Article 6.2 and the international mechanism under Article 6.4, and then one market-based mechanisms under Article 6.8. And of course, with regard to climate finance, we have the deadline for the new collective quantitative goal for international climate finance after 2025. And this deadline is next year, but of course, one cannot negotiate everything within 1 year. So there was a 2-year program to actually promote these negotiations. So quite a number of broad topics, so more on a plate than a normal COP would have. And of course, 2 real headline items, the global stocktake and the loss and damage fund. Of course, a presidency of the COP always has its own aims and strategies. So there was a formal announcement of 4 paradigm shifts that the UAE presidency wanted to achieve. So accelerating the energy transition and curbing emissions before 2030, then revolutionizing climate finance by laying the groundwork for a new finance paradigm, so quite ambitious paradigm shift, then placing nature, people and their livelihoods at the forefront of climate action. Again, sounds nice. Of course, the question is how to operationalize, and then achieving a very inclusive COP. So beautiful language, but of course challenging to actually implement. And the global stocktake was from the beginning the highest priority. And the UAE stated it wanted to have a negotiated outcome, so a text. Of course, initially it was not clear what type of text was to be promoted. Then as a so-called action agenda, which in the past I've always called the side deals. We've seen such side deals, for example, in Glasgow, but already in the early COPs, certain side deals were made. And then a call to action, of course, that relates to the ratcheting up overall. Then the UAE presidency made a push for renewable energy and energy efficiency. So it came very early with this aim of tripling renewables capacity. And the UAE was very clear about what it meant, because I've seen various media articles now saying, yeah, the tripling of renewables target in the global stocktake is not giving a baseline. I would understand this target to actually mean the 11,000 gigawatts that the UAE presidency clearly laid out earlier. They don't show up in the global stocktake text, but I think it's clear how this target came about, and I would hope that we would see such interpretation also generally. And then doubling the rate of increase of energy efficiency by 2030, there the baseline was not defined clearly. Then the second agenda item with regards to renewable energy related to hydrogen. UAE wanted to double global hydrogen production to 180 million tons per year by 2030 and promoting global trade, which is of course important. If the UAE wants to shift from fossil fuel towards a renewable economy, then of course hydrogen would be a critical aspect of that. Of course, in the run-up to the COP, there was a lot of debate. Is the agenda of the UAE presidency actually credible? because there was a lot of debate with regard to the person of the COP president himself, Minister of Industry of the UAE, but also the group CEO of the ADNOC company, which of course is one of the biggest oil producers in the world. And ADNOC has clearly stated in the past that it wants to expand its oil production significantly. And well, even if one now makes a lot of effort, this is clearly not in line with UNFC targets unless ADNOC would be able now to get into carbon capture and storage very quickly. What was quite interesting, and that was coming already in the early days of the COP, was the push for a for-profit climate investment fund mobilized by the UAE called Altera. And the UAE stated that this would mobilize $30 billion and leverage a total of 83 billion. These, of course, are staggering figures. It has not been made really clear how this would actually operate. What was communicated is that this fund would actually invest directly into companies that provide mitigation solutions, and that 5 of the 30 billion would be earmarked for investment in developing countries, of course, as per the definition of the UNFC, so that could also be countries of the Gulf region. And there has been the announcement to have 2 billion each into funds that try to invest into companies that are still very much in the fossil fuel business, but that have a credible transition narrative. So, of course, the question now comes, to what degree can one really make sure that this narrative is credible? But I would hope that now in the post-COP environment, these interesting approaches will be developed further and detailed. Then we have a number of side deals, and the UAE always was communicating these numbers on the side in giant TV screens. So a declaration on a global climate finance framework, a coalition for high ambition multi-level partnership, then a lot of side deals on energy transition, so global renewables and energy efficiency pledge, which essentially would underwrite the renewable energy and energy efficiency targets that I already mentioned. Then an interesting pledge regarding the cooling sector, which of course is quite important in the context of mitigation in the long term. Then mutual recognition of certification schemes for renewable and low carbon hydrogen. Also, of course, in the context of the hydrogen focus that was mentioned earlier. Then an oil and gas decarbonization charter for oil and gas companies, 52 signatories for that, which of course is interesting, but of course it's important now to understand what the initiative actually means in terms of follow-up and monitoring. Then many NGOs don't like this, of course, and I was actually also startled by the huge number of nuclear energy lobbyists visible at the COP. The declaration to triple nuclear energy, which of course is in parallel with the tripling of renewable electricity. And then an interesting initiative, the so-called Industrial Transition Accelerator. So that, of course, is somehow modeled on the Energy Transition Accelerator that was already unveiled by the US in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27. And then on agriculture and food, a declaration on sustainable agriculture, resilient food systems signed by 153 countries, so the biggest number of signatories. Of course, these side deals always suffer from being relatively vague when it comes to parameters, targets, instruments. So we need to see which ones of those really remain relevant in the long term. But of course, in terms of the overall communication strategy, the COP presidency did a good job. Now, of course, I focus on what actually happened on the ground. This was clearly the biggest COP that has been done so far. It was the largest COP site ever, 4.5 square kilometers, of which about 1/3 the blue zone and 2/3 the green zone. So blue zone, of course, means the zone which is for the negotiations and where only those who have a formal accreditation can go, whereas the green zone is kind of fair for the general public. And I must say that both zones were really set up beautifully in the World Expo site. But of course, it also meant that we have achieved the pinnacle of what I would call expoization of COPs. It's a clear tendency that we see more and more pavilions where countries, but also institutions, private sector present themselves. And now it was really the pinnacle because these were exactly the pavilions that were used at the World Expo in the past. So there were 102 countries having a pavilion and more than 100 international organizations, private sector players, coalitions were having such pavilions. So it would have taken at least 3 days to visit all of those pavilions. And of course, this is attractive for host countries of a COP because they will generate a lot of revenues from the sale of these pavilions. I was involved in one pavilion and yeah, it was quite expensive to have that. And of course, that meant some money would come in for the host. We've seen a record high of over 100,000 participants, double the previous record. The final list of participants is not yet out, so I'm referring to the numbers from the so-called PLOP, the provisional list of participants. So we had 25,000 government delegates registered. We had for the first time numbers for the so-called party overflow. That means you get a party badge, but you can't speak on behalf of the party. And I was really startled by this huge number, which was the biggest of any categories. In the past, that was not reported, so we don't have comparisons. I hope that UNFCCC will also report the numbers for the past COPs. And what is really startling, only 15,000 of those 100,000, so really a small share came from the official observer organizations, which of course should be the real focus of these conferences if you want to involve stakeholders. And we have now a new category that's called host country guests. And that was also 5,000 people. So it was more than the whole COP for many years. So a huge thing. And of course, that was quite impressive to see that after initial hiccups, the logistics of the site was working quite well. But of course, given this huge site, we had challenges. The side events actually were really not well attended. And I have been organizing side events throughout every COP I've attended. That's now 26. And the attendance was really bad. We have seen side events with 5 attendance, 10 attendance. A side event of 50 was already good. But if you have probably 50,000 people on the site, that means people are doing other things. They are no longer exchanging about new ideas in side events. And this I find a really problematic tendency. Well, it took about 15 minutes to go and briskly walk from one end of the COP blue zone to the negotiation rooms. And of course, it was a problem. Then also one should note that fossil fuel action was quite visible at the COP. On the right-hand side, you see the photo of a book which was distributed at the OPEC booth at the COP. So I would not actually like not to see such publications at the COP. And also The Guardian unveiled on the first day of the COP that the UAE clearly planned to use its role to do fossil fuel deals. And the UAE didn't actually provide a statement that it was not trying to do this. So it's clear that this happened. And of course, this is outrageous. One really needs to say. OPEC sent a letter to all its members stating, yeah, this is now really serious. One needs to do something to prevent that fossil fuel phase out could be mentioned in the global stocktake text. And of course, there were several thousand fossil fuel representatives on site, sometimes in the government delegations, sometimes outside of the government delegations. I would expect a number in the party overflow. Now, of course, with the beautiful Excel list of delegates, one can neatly search for this and follow up. What was the spirit of the negotiations? And the spirit, as I already said, the sprawling COP site made interactions difficult. The beauty of a COP is that you usually meet old friends, colleagues whom you don't see for the rest of the years. And usually I really relish to sit at a certain spot in the center of a COP and just meet people also by chance. And this was very difficult at this COP. You really had to organize yourself. There was no central spot, which would mean everybody passes by. And so, yeah, this character of the COP as really a place for such meetings was lost a bit. Initially, the observer participation in the negotiation sessions was hugely problematic. I'm serving on the board of the Research and Independent NGOs, and our board lost a lot of time distributing tickets. There were 2 tickets for each of the about 20 negotiation streams. The UNSC told us, if you lose the ticket, you don't get a replacement. So one needed to develop a system how the ticket would move between people. And of course, that meant if anybody in this chain of people was unreliable, the ticket actually and the access to the negotiation room would be lost. So our co-focal points at the Ringos then said, if a ticket is lost, then the organization, the university or research institution to whom the person belongs who lost the ticket would be excluded from tickets in the future, because one needed to have a stick, otherwise it wouldn't work. And only at the very end of the conference, this ticket system was abolished, and there was a lot of complaints that the rooms were overcrowded, and even parties could not get into the room. So that was a problem, and I hope that the Secretariat can deal with it in a better manner. We had in a number of negotiation streams a low level of trust. The exchanges were sharper than in the past couple of COPs. We didn't have walkouts, at least not on a larger scale, but yeah, it was a challenge. Of course, Dubai in December had nice weather, of course, no rain, nice possibility to stay outside, but of course, as usual in the Middle East, despite this beautiful temperature, which in Europe anyone would have survived without air conditioning, the buildings on the COP site were cooled down in a way. And actually in our building, we had for the NGO offices, we negotiated with the building manager. We switched off every switch you could switch off. He said, no, we can't go beyond that temperature because there is still a central system. Well, yeah, but then the central system should be managed accordingly. What was quite positive is that NGOs could express themselves and protest on site. You see a picture on the right. So, of course, there had been some uneasiness with regard to the UAE's record in this context, but one could say that NGOs were able to engage and nicely bring the protest. Of course, not in the city because the COP site was far away from the city. Now I'll get into the specific topics, and I'll start with the global stocktake. So the starting point after COP27 and SB was that there were, of course, this synthesis report of the technical dialogues. So you know that the global stocktake, of course, had a strong technical component where hundreds of institutions submitted input, and that, of course, had to be compiled. The key bones of contention in the negotiations at the COP were, of course, that global stocktake was like a lens concentrating sun rays. So all the critical issues converged in the global stocktake negotiations. So we had the classical fights of developed against developing countries on action versus finance, with developed countries saying, yeah, please developing countries act, and developing countries saying, well, look, developed countries, you need to give us money, then we can act, but not before. Then, of course, the historical versus forward-looking responsibility. So there was an interesting discussion about the wording of the use of remaining carbon budget, which developed countries didn't like. But then there was a term course correction that the developing countries didn't like. I'm just picking out a few. And of course, we had hundreds of such conflicts in the context of the text. Then, of course, as was to be expected, the fossil fuel phase out, phase down language was really in the spotlight and heavily contested. We also had a really stark debate about the role of science. The way to reference IPCC reports was hugely contested. And I just want to pick out a statement by the Chinese in the global Stocktake, where they first said, yeah, IPCC gives that and that information on the historical contribution to the emissions. And of course, that's very important. But then when it comes to the future emission pathways, that of course all is biased and it should not be taken into account. So it became a real pick and choose context of the parties with regard to the science. And yeah, this is unsettling because, yeah, it's very difficult for scientists then to really be enabled to counter react to such attempts to, bend the science, essentially. Then there was a lot of discussion about what role human rights, indigenous rights, and gender equality should have in that text. And many other aspects, of course. So there were two revisions of the texts. First, of course, we had these elements of text that were nice because they enabled to have still good open negotiations about critical aspects. So there were no brackets in the text, but this text actually allowed good and free exchange. Then the first revision came with text that, of course, no longer had open ends, and it had some good landing zones. But then the second revision of the text, that was very much skewed towards those countries that didn't want to do much. So it seemed that the presidency was trying to make expectation management and then in the end come out with a text which is seen as a bit more progressive, so would be able to bring in the countries that want to see more action. So what can we say about the outcome? And of course, here it will remain relatively general. Of course, one can make a detailed discussion of that global Stocktake text. And of course, in the webinar I'm going to have on Wednesday, I'll go into more detail. I would say the text is good with regard to defining the gap towards the 1.5 degree target. And actually in the penultimate text, 1.5 degree had got lost in the text, and that of course infuriated many. So now the wording says limiting global warming to 1.5 degree with no or limited overshoot requires deep, rapid and sustained reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions of 43% by 2030 and 60% by 2035. So very clear numbers. And also specifying baseline 2019 and reaching net zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2050. So this is good language. I think it would be difficult to word it more concisely and more clearly. But then when we have the language around the key global actions, the language becomes very fluffy. It says, we call on parties to contribute to, so already two qualifiers, in a nationally determined manner. That's, of course, a reference to the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, and to accelerate efforts, and now efforts towards what? And there's a list of actions, and they don't really all fit together. So the first relevant action would be towards the phase down of unabated coal power. So this is essentially just repeating what we already had at Sharm el-Sheikh. Got at Sharm el-Sheikh, it was a cover decision, and now it's a real decision. So that's now a bit better anchored, but it's exactly the same language. Well, the language is relatively good. It says net zero emission energy systems utilizing zero and low carbon fuels well before or by around mid-century. Now, of course, you can debate what is a low carbon fuel. You can debate what is around mid-century. Around can be 30 years, between 2020 to 2080. So, of course, we have some open things there, but yeah, I would hope that we'll get to grips with clearer definitions in the future. And then there is a wording that has taken a lot of interest, of course, transitioning away from fossil fuels and energy systems. So, well, that's nice language, but of course, yeah, it doesn't say exactly how and where. Well, it says just orderly and equitable. I found the term orderly interesting. We see orderly usually as a term which is a bit negative. Well, I don't know whether it means orderly in the sense of the Brazilian flag where it says order and progress, but yeah, so the interpretation of that term will certainly raise a lot of dust in the next couple of months and years. And then, well, it makes reference to the critical decade, so the language that many were pushing prior to the COP, to achieve net zero by 2050 in keeping with the science. Good, that's nice wording. Net zero, of course, the question is it net zero carbon or net zero greenhouse gases? So that remains open. And of course, yeah, keeping with the science, does it mean IPCC or what else? But overall, the wording is nice. And then it makes reference to the tripling of renewables and doubling the energy efficiency. It doesn't reference specifically the 11,000 gigawatts, but yeah, I would think that the history, and if we look at case law, the history of such provisions counts, we could hopefully work with 11,000 gigawatts. Then, of course, we have a number of statements that put also qualifiers. So it recognizes the transitional fuels. It doesn't mention what fuels it means, but it probably means gas. And then when it comes to the specific further action, there is no really strong language towards 1.5 degree aligned NDCs. So I would have hoped for much stronger text regarding the 2025 update of the NDCs, but that is the language essentially makes reference to the provisions of the Paris Agreement. Then there had been a lot of debate about trade measures, CBAM, and now the language I have quoted verbatim. Measures should not constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination or disguised restriction on international trade. So that, of course, is relatively clear language, and we have to see what this means now with regard to the further development of CBAM or the discrimination against certain types of emission credits in international carbon markets. So that will become quite interesting. We've seen important links to biodiversity, resilient food systems, to oceans, to mountains, and of course other aspects that were also part of the thematic days of the COP. Particularly this food systems issue has gained a lot of traction, as well as the ocean issues, and of course biodiversity. The link to Kunming is now clearly in that text. Now let me go to the loss and damage fund. The loss and damage fund, of course, had been deliberated in the context of the so-called transitional committee, which was set up due to the Sharm el-Sheikh decision. This was, as expected, rather contentious. in the 5th meeting in November, and there the presidency made a huge effort to get an outcome. There was a compromise draft recommendation text forwarded to the COP, and that was already more than one could expect. And of course, the key bones of contention in the run-up to the COP were the issue of governance. Should the fund be standalone, or should it be hosted by an existing institution? Then the question, who pays into the fund? Is it mandatory or voluntary contributions? Should there also be a role for emerging economies? Should there be a role of the so-called innovative sources of finance, such as air traffic taxes, financial transaction taxes, so on? Then the question is, who is eligible? Should it only be the particularly vulnerable developing countries or all developing countries? Noting that developing countries in UNSC language also means Arab states. And what should be the types of support? Should it be only grants or loans or insurance? Or how could one ensure new and additional? So very difficult topics. Past experience has shown that only one of these aspects can actually lead to a stalemate. But, and that was really a big surprise also to me, to get a decision of a COP on the first day on a kind of really very contentious issue, that was a big feat and achievement of the presidency. And of course, this didn't happen in a vacuum. They had been negotiating behind the scenes, and they had actually negotiated with Germany that both Germany and the UAE would provide 100 million into the fund. And then, of course, that led to other countries also pledging. The pledge from the US was not particularly impressive, but the fact that they at all made a pledge was impressive given the long-standing hostility of the US against the loss and damage topic. So we have pledges of about 0.7 billion, which is quite good for a new vehicle. Of course, it's much less than developing countries have asked for. So there will definitely be a lot of debate how to further perennialize the fund. But it was a good starting point, and it was the first substantial climate finance contribution from an Arab country, which also is remarkable. The World Bank will be the interim host of the fund. That was, of course, a bitter pill to swallow for developing countries who don't like the World Bank. And I am also uneasy about how the World Bank will actually manage this properly. There are certain conditions that the bank must meet. And there is also now a fallback option if the bank somehow doesn't achieve the conditions. What one should also note, of course, after this decision on the first day about the fund, there were continuing negotiations during the COP about the Santiago Network. And the Santiago Network for Loss and Damage will now be hosted by the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and UNOPS. Disaster Risk Reduction Office, of course, is quite interesting because so far it has not really been involved in climate change matters. UNOPS has been quite active in climate change matters in the past, so we'll have to see how this actually works. But of course, it means that we have a strong involvement of the UN into the loss and damage. With regard to the climate finance negotiations, of course, we have had various dialogues throughout 2023. We have the classical bones of contention, the structure and the time frame of the goal, the quantum, the sources of funding, and of course, transparency of arrangement. Unsurprisingly, to me, there was no real progress on any of that. There's a procedural outcome referring the topic to COP29 and organizing the work plan for 2024. What I found interesting was the last para of the decision, which states that there should be finance from a wide variety of sources, instruments, and channels. That's, of course, good for also any institution who wants to engage in the discussion. And then this last part of the sentence, how the structure will impact the scale. That's a really interesting wording because, it somehow implies that the volume, the quantum, then depends on the structure of the goal. But yeah, we didn't achieve much progress in terms of the content, but that was also not expected from that COP. Global goal of adaptation. So that was now the end point of a 2-year work program to develop a framework. And there was, of course, a lot of debate about financing for adaptation, so-called means of implementation. So should there be a specific finance targets or just mentioning of enabling conditions? Then, of course, the principles, CBDRC, should they be brought up specifically or not? Then whether specific sectors or themes would be addressed and targets for each of their sectors and timelines would be set or not. Then the question about indicators. I already mentioned that this is very thorny. There has been a lot of debate. Can we find indicators which really enable us to deal with adaptation on the ground? Then there was an interesting discussion coming up regarding the term maladaptation and transformational adaptation. So some countries really thought that referring to maladaptation might reduce their access to finance, which I found really interesting, given that, in my view, those countries should take it very seriously, not to maladapt, but maybe the time horizon of policymakers is very short. And then the question whether there should be a permanent agenda item on the global goal of adaptation, like we have other agenda items that are always repeated in the COP. So the outcome was weak. Actually, I would have hoped one sees more progress on critical aspects. So finance, there was really nothing, apparently, because the finance negotiations are scheduled for next year. We have now this number of dimensions and themes that for which there are very broadly defined targets, but these targets are all voluntary and there is no real basis to compare between targets. And also there is no real timeline until when these targets should be set. So if we compare it with mitigation, it's really fluffy. There will be a 2-year work program on indicators that will become certainly very interesting, but let's hope that the discussion will really get into nitty-gritties, because there, if we can get progress on indicators, then I would think we can also overcome in the long run this shortfall of adaptation funding compared to mitigation funding. Maladaptation is mentioned, but on a relatively generic level. The text does actually refer to transformational and the incremental adaptation and requests the Secretariat to do work. So I would hope that we'll get some technical papers on these concepts. But there will not be an agenda item on GGA. So that's, in my view, a missed opportunity, because adaptation is as critical as mitigation and more critical for many countries. So I understand, of course, why some parties and also the Secretary doesn't want a proliferation of agenda items, but it again reinforces that adaptation is seen as secondary aspect in the climate change negotiations. With regard to just transition, we have now a work program that has been institutionalized and will start next year with a contact group and annual dialogues, ministerial roundtables. So it has all the elements of a work program, and it will be reviewed in 2026. So past historical experience with such work programs means that it could then generate some traction, but of course one needs to see how it, for example, relates to the progress of the just energy transition partnerships and other targets. And of course the question, how one can define human rights, gender rights of workers in general, given certain participants and parties in the COP are not really actually enabling these rights. That will certainly remain a thorny issue. With regard to the mitigation work program, yeah, this, of course, has always been standing a bit uneasily besides the NDC updating process. And now there is essentially procedural texts. There will be dialogues, investment-focused events, actionable solution debates. But yeah, it's not clear how it actually is different from the Just Transition Work Program. So I fear that this mitigation work program will end up a bit as an orphan in the system. Article 6, we've had a lot of nitty-gritty technical elements, but also really political contention. So, for example, there's still a debate what actually would be seen as a cooperative approach. Is it an approach where there need to be 2 or more countries, or can it be a unilateral thing? And that came up very strongly. Then the question is about the reporting. Is there enough time for the reviews? And will there be the possibility for the reviews to influence further, let's say, further reports? Will we bring in, for example, the compliance committee or not? Then the so-called agreed electronic format, the reporting template. Then the question of confidential information, which of course we've also seen in that transparency negotiations, and the issue of the international registry. So the international registry is important because there is a big fight between countries who want the registry to enable transactions and those countries who want to protect their domestic voluntary carbon market industry that operate registries and who want that only those registries can do transaction. So it's essentially industrial policy that's coming in and making the debates, which originally were very technical, now highly political. Then with regard to Article 6.4, we have, of course, again, these registry problems. But the biggest problem was on the methodological requirements and the removal activity guidance, because there we already had the COP27, which was originally scheduled to decide on this. At COP27, the Article 6.4 supervisory body had not been able to agree on a text on methodological guidance, but had agreed on a removal text, but the removal text had been given back to the supervisory body by the COP. And there are many aspects that are really critical. For example, shall the baselines be more stringent than the business as usual? And shall they be adjusted downwards over time as the target of the Paris Agreement would require, in my point of view? And then, of course, how to ensure permanence, how to deal with the risks for reversal of carbon stocks after removals. How long should you monitor such removals? And many, many specific aspects. And we'll discuss this in detail also in the seminar on Wednesday. So the outcome was very disappointing. 6.2 and 6.4 texts could not be adopted. Interestingly, the 6.8 text passed. Usually, we've always seen Article 6 as a package. So normally, everything would be linked and no text could pass on its own. But it was really unusual because actually the US objected to the 6.8 text, but then the chair went down to the US table in the last session. And then the US withdrew its objection, which is also very unusual. So how would I assess the COP in total? I would say it's a glass that is full a bit more than half, maybe 60%. I think the presidency was really successful regarding the loss and damage fund. It was a great strategy to get this out of the way in the first day, unprecedented, because usually we have this principle of nothing is agreed until everything is agreed of the whole package. And of course, it was nicely greased by the host country pledging the 100 million, which is exactly the role of a good presidency. It needs to bring in some resources, otherwise things don't move. And of course, generating the positive dynamics that reached the 0.7 billion pledge. The question, of course, is this 100 billion from UAE a breakthrough for climate finance by non-Annex II countries, or is it a swallow that will not be followed? We don't know yet. The global Stocktake text, I think, was a good compromise in the sense that everybody was equally unhappy with. Of course, we've heard strong unhappiness by the AOSIS, but AOSIS didn't want to scupper the deal. So the presidency had a really good understanding of the political dynamics. And after a few COPs with a lot of drama in the final plenary, I was quite pleased by having stuff hammered through without huddles and reopening of texts. So I think they did it in a really professional manner. And we have good language on the gaps and the signs, and that has actually overcome prior deadlocks in the negotiations. But we have very convoluted language on fossil fuel reduction, and that will certainly be understood differently by different stakeholders. And I found very interesting that the COP president, only 2 days after the end of the COP, said, yeah, this does not mean that ADNOC will reduce its oil production. So that actually was confirming the fears of those who think that the text is not going far enough. And the big question is now whether the NDC updates will actually reflect the action items or whether the global stocktake will be forgotten quickly. And I just want to note a historical precedent. There was the so-called demonstrable progress under the Kyoto Protocol. That was in 2005, because it had clearly been felt that it's such a long period between 1997 and 2008. So there should be some interim ratcheting up action. So this demonstrable progress document, but the document was quickly falling into oblivion. So yeah, let's hope that the NDC updates will really now be pushed also by civil society based on the global stocktake text. And of course, what one needs to say, it was good that it's a standalone decision. It's not something that is somehow having a second level status. Unfortunately, and you know that I'm, of course, focusing on market mechanisms in my professional work, the market mechanisms somehow fell on the wayside. The presidency made it very clear that the mechanisms are not important for them. And I think it's really highly problematic that we've lost another year to operationalize the Article 6.4 mechanism. This is a crucial mechanism we need for international ambition rising. And now we have one shot left to actually operationalize it next year. Yeah, and I'm wondering whether we'll be able to do that. So I would like to summarize that the COP has shown that multilateralism in climate policy is continuing, but I would say it's plodding along. It's not making great strides. And yeah, with that, I want to come to the look towards the future. So next year, we will have the COP in Baku in Azerbaijan. It's, of course, critical because we need to agree on the new finance target and Article 6. And, well, I've never seen Azerbaijan making statements in the COPs on content. It's clearly a petrostate. It has no, well, pedigree on any, let's say, mitigation action or adaptation action. It has strong links to regimes that are problematic. It has been fighting wars very recently. Will it be able to achieve this? It needs a lot of support. Then we have the following COP in Brazil, which will be held in Belém in the Amazonian forest. So that clearly shows that Brazil wants to make it a forest COP. I would hope it also becomes an ambition COP because it is summarizing the NDC updates, hopefully. So let's see. Of course, actually, the current Brazilian government is doing good things on climate policy. But yeah, if it becomes too much of a forest COP, it could be a bit of a distraction. Then the following COP will go to Australia. Australia, of course, has historically been a roller coaster with regard to climate policy, but the current government seems to be serious. I think it could focus nicely on small island state issues, on ocean issues, on green hydrogen. So let's hope that they will take the opportunity. The following COP is in Western Europe. It's not yet clear which countries will become candidate. But then the subsequent COP, the second Global Stocktake COP, will be hosted by India. At least India has clearly put its candidacy, and I think India will not be contested by any other country. And of course, it could play a key role in a good global stocktake if it's serious. So yeah, with that, I would like to also, of course, announce this second webinar, which will do a deep dive, which also will enable to discuss questions, because now in 1 hour, of course, we can't unfortunately discuss questions. I, of course, note that many of you would like to do that, but yeah, it's just not possible. Of course, you can also approach me individually if you have some really burning things, but yeah. I would like to refer you to that webinar that's coming up now on Wednesday. That will have a full 2 hours and where we can really go into depth. So with that, I would like to thank you. I see we've had more than 500 participants. That has been a record level also for me. And I'm thankful for that and looking forward to also contributing to understanding of COPs in the next years. Thank you very much.